Good evening, everybody. I'm Dick Clay. I'm the president of the Filson Historical Society, and I'm so glad that you joined us for tonight's presentation, which is sponsored by Cave Hill Cemetery and Heritage Foundation. Thank you again for joining us for tonight's presentation, George Keats of Kentucky. Lawrence M. Crutcher, who goes by Larry, a longstanding Filson member, grew up in Louisville before attending Yale and getting his MBA from Harvard Business School. He concluded a 25-year publishing career at Time Inc. as head of the Book of the Month Club. He currently divides his time between Tucson, Arizona and Watch Hill, Rhode Island. I'll return to moderate questions after the presentation as time permits. But if you would, please join me in welcoming this thoroughly engaging and very nice 9th or 10th generation Kentuckian, who is the great grandson of George Keats. Larry?
Thank you, Dick, and thank each one of you for joining tonight. I see on the list that there are two people with the name Keats, one of them being Keats Thaxton, whom I know. So if I go off script, I hope you'll tell me that I made a mistake. A couple of ringers to keep me straight. This is the first time I've gone through one of these operations where we have a slideshow going on, and I hope that technically it's all going to work just fine. I'll give you greetings from Watch Hill, Rhode Island, where I am right now, and that is experiencing weather just like Louisville, just like the Ohio River Valley so far. But anyway, I want to tell you what a pleasure it is to be with you, and an honor. It all began a number of years ago when I was in the Filson, fumbling around with its computer, trying to figure out this, that, and the other thing. And a woman named Shirley Harmon walked up and said, "What are you doing? Why are you here?" And so I explained to her. And she said, "Do you know about the manuscript that Naomi Kirk wrote trying to do a biography of George Keats?" And I didn't. So she found that for me and a number of other documents, and she translated them and got us off and running. So it's been a terrific experience, and I hope that some of you have had the same experience. Now we are, with any kind of luck, going to get ourselves into the slideshow. This is an image of George Keats, and for those of you who know art, you might be surprised to know that this is a watercolor miniature on ivory. So it's about the size of the palm of your hand. And imagine the detail that the artist Joe Severn gave to it. It sits in the Keats house in London. What we're going to go through is not just a biography of Keats, but also some background on the city of Louisville, because not too many stories have surfaced between the period of 1818 when he arrived and 1841 when he died. But in that time frame, Louisville got itself a canal. It became a city. It was for a period the premier entrepot for the old Northwest. It survived the dissolution of the U.S. Bank. It created free public education for all, began the University of Louisville, a museum was chartered, and a railroad came to town. George Keats was involved in every one of those. Just to give you a little chronology, he was born in London, 1797, married and immigrated in 1818, and died young of some intestinal ailment in 1841 in Louisville. His brother John Keats, the poet, was a little bit older, born in 1795, died at age 26 in Rome. And they lived during the period of George III and the regency of George IV. In the case of George, when he arrived, President Monroe was in office. And when the year that he died, there were 3 presidents: Van Buren, Harrison, and Tyler. I'm going to do a little digression here for those of you who have an interest in genealogy. I'm not much of a genealogist, but I did a book which the University Press of Kentucky published a few years back, and I was attempting to find the origins of the family. And there were about 7 different theories. Nobody knew. It was a dark hole. And they ranged from being ship owners and coastal trawlers and to pharmacists in Reading. And I just reported all 7 of those. The book got itself into the hands of a gentleman, a plasterer in Cornwall named Rob Keats. Rob got in touch with me and he said, I know the real story. There was a farmer by the name of John Keats, who was the grandfather of George and John. And he lived in Broadmain, about a mile outside of Dorchester, and died early. And his widow and several children could not support themselves. They went to the poorhouse. The widow then got diphtheria and died. So Tom Keats, the father of George and John, was truly an orphan, and his brother James as well. So what happened is not quite clear, but Tom ended up being sent to London at about age 18 to work in an hostelry. And there's a picture of one here, which is very close to where he lived. And what it was is a way station on the way into London from Kent, where people could drop off, water their horse, drop in the pub, have a pint or 2, and then proceed on into London. They also rented horses for the day. So it was a little bit like a Hertz station with a bar attached to it. And that is their origins, rather humble. But some people like to say they're related to King George or whatever, but in the Keats case, not true. Today, if you were to go to London and take the tube to the Moorfields station, as you come up the stairs of the tube station, you would see a sign kind of in the middle of this, which says Keats at the Globe. And that's a bar which still exists. We think that George was born upstairs in this house. But his father, Tom, married the boss's daughter, Frances Jennings, and things were definitely going uphill for them. The father-in-law, John Jennings, was able to retire to the country, and Tom Keats and his wife ran the business successfully, and they could afford to send their kids to a boarding school called Clarke's School, and they were able to move out of the hostelry into a house. This is a terrible image, but it actually is on Craven Road in Hackney. These are all gone, but this picture dates back to about 1910. And so they had a townhouse, and the kids were away at boarding school, and life was good. Then disaster struck in 1804 when the boys were about 8 and 5. And the father, Tom Keats, had been visiting the kids at school, and he came home one Sunday night. His horse slipped and fell, tossing Tom Keats into the gates of this cemetery, Bunhill Fields Cemetery. And then the horse landed on Tom Keats and then bolted back to the stable, leaving Tom dead. So everything changed in a period of about 6 weeks. His widow, Frances Keats, got into a bad marriage with a guy who was going to take over the pub. They lost it within 2 years. They ran it into the ground, separated. The kids were sent off to live with the grandmother, who was very old and unable to take care of them. So they were living at school primarily. The grandfather died, and the whole situation changed. The grandmother, as she was dying, assigned the kids to a guardian named Richard Abbey. And Mr. Abbey immediately pulled the kids out of the school, sent George to a counting house in his tea brokerage, age 13. He was doing the accounts, and apprenticed the poet John Keats off to a surgeon to learn how to pull teeth and stitch up wounds and set broken arms. And it wasn't a particularly successful thing, although John Keats was sneaking views of Spenser's Faerie Queen and other Milton and other, and he knew Greek. So he got himself into a whole side career while he was at medical school. George stayed with the counting house for about 4 or 5 years, but nothing is forever. And so they moved off to Hampstead. Oh, this is Enfield, where their grandmother lived. This is the school, Clarke School, where the kids went. And then and this is Hampstead Heath. So they moved out to Hampstead to get better air, get away from London's dank air. And John quit his internship at Guy's Hospital and began writing poetry. And George began dating a woman named Georgiana Wiley. And here I have another digression. Georgiana Wiley's father, listed on the birth certificate, was an Army adjutant named James Wiley, who, unfortunately for historians, died 3 years before she was born. So there's a bit of a mystery as to who her father was, but I think I know the answer. And she grew up in a single mom household, proving that those things happened even 200 years ago. So it's nothing new about those kinds of relationships. John and the poet and Georgiana liked each other tremendously, and he wrote a little poem to her, the heading of which was "Nymph of the downward smile and sidelong glance, art thou most lovely?" So the point I'm trying to make with these genealogical digressions is that it's true, I would think, for probably most of us in the audience, that we really are not related to Queen Victoria or anybody else. Most of our ancestors were of modest means, and most of them came to America because they needed a new opportunity. They needed to get away from the situation they were trapped in England. George and John actually did have a slight inheritance. They had two, but they had one from their father. And when he turned 21, he claimed it and decided that it was not sufficient to invest in a business in London where he could be the owner and the boss. Instead, he felt that his opportunity was better to go to America. He didn't want to bow to customers in a shop in London. But in America, he thought he could invest and make a killing. That's what they heard that was happening. Democracy was working and people were getting rich. And John's publisher had brought out a book by Morris Birkbeck. And Birkbeck was promoting a settlement in southern Illinois, down about where Albion, Illinois is today. And it was going to be a model English town. So George said, fine, let's do it. He thought maybe he could buy 1,200 acres with his inheritance and he could develop them and sell them at a huge profit and return to London as a gentleman in a life of ease. Of course, the problem was that George's experience with farming was limited to maybe an occasional walk in a country lane in Dorset. He knew nothing about it. But John supported the move and off they went. It turned out to be, here's a picture of John Keats, also by Joseph Severn, and his girlfriend, Fanny Braun, who we'll talk about in a second. So when John bid adieu to George in Liverpool and they left, he then went into the most productive 2 years of his life. He was under the care of a guy by the name of Charles Brown, pictured here, who took care of all the finances and ordered in the wine and the beef and kept John going. And it was as I say, they call it the posthumous year, but it wasn't posthumous. It was the year before Keats died. And he was extremely productive thanks to these people. So George and Georgiana sailed forth, and the boat had ship that looked just like this. This is called a packet ship. It's a 7-week journey from Liverpool to Philadelphia. And during the journey, George was apparently sick most of the time. However, Georgiana became pregnant on the voyage, so it wasn't a total loss. They had a cabin which cost 90 pounds, equivalent to about 9,000 US dollars today. And it was described by a writer who was on another ship just like it. And I was going to quote, their cabin was a hastily fitted up hole where you have but just room to turn yourself around and barely height to sit up in bed. A person 6 feet high should never think of going to sea in such a vessel. Now, George is 5'11", so he was in trouble. Passengers had to bring on their own food and laundry, which sounds a little bit like United Airlines today. When they arrived in Philadelphia, they actually got an article in the local newspaper. And again, it's a direct quote. It says, the Keatses were a complete Bond Street bow and bell and shockingly unfit for their destination, for that is a miserable place of Birkbeck's. Anyway, off they went. George bought a wagon with 2 horses for an arduous 6-day journey over to Pittsburgh. He passed by farms, which are now, of course, beautiful. Pennsylvania, the valleys is just terrifically productive. But at that time, the writer wrote that the appearance of the farms, their implements, the neglected state of livestock and the cornfields will excite in an Englishman much disgust. But he will see at once how a little industry could greatly improve and how much could be done with the country, considering the carelessness and inattention that are currently there. So in Pittsburgh, sold the wagon, arranged for the horses to be set out to Kentucky, or he thought to Indiana, and booked passage on a keelboat. This slide probably is familiar to many of you. And it's probably the one on the left is the type of boat that they were on. Basically a barn on a barge. But nevertheless, they had a really tranquil time floating down the river. It was their honeymoon. They could enjoy looking at the lofty bluffs and with woods and cottonwood trees and sycamore trees, and they just didn't have to worry about a thing except enjoy nature. So George had been given some letters of introduction in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Cincinnati. And toward the end of that chain of contacts was John James Audubon, who was in Henderson, Kentucky at the time. So they stopped off and saw Audubon, and then they proceeded over to Princeton, Indiana, where Birkbeck had a staging operation for his prairie community in Illinois. George left Georgiana there, and he went over to Illinois to look at the land and realized that the community didn't exist. There were a couple of English people who had ventured out there. They had no concept of how to turn the rock-hard soil into fertile land. There was no good water. There was no available labor. Remember, Illinois was a free state, so no slaves. And there was no housing. So George quickly realized this was not for him, turned around and went back to Henderson to be with Audubon as a paying guest in his house. A few years later, most of you know that Charles Dickens came to America, and Dickens wrote a novel called Martin Chuzzlewit, which was in part modeled on George Keats. So what Dickens wrote was that Chuzzlewit was shown to a miserable cabin, rudely constructed of the trunks of trees, the door of which had either fallen down or been long ago carried away. It was perfectly bare of furniture. A fetid vapor rose up from the earth, and as his footprints sunk into the marshy ground, a black ooze started forth to blot them out. So that was his introduction to farming in America. When they got back to Henderson, he still had his money. And Audubon, unbeknownst to the Keatses, was himself sinking into bankruptcy. He had decided to build a large grist mill in conjunction with his brother-in-law, Tom Bakewell. They hired an engineer to build the steam engine to power the grist mill, but it was an engine really designed for a steamboat, and it didn't work. As Audubon wrote in his own journal, this was an enormous expense in a country then as unfit for such a thing as it would be for me to attempt to settle in the moon. Of course, Audubon didn't know about Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, but that was back then. So Bakewell, the brother-in-law, figured out that wasn't going to work, and he withdrew his capital from the mill in cash, leaving Audubon with a note for a steamboat that he owned. And then Bakewell decamped for Louisville. So Audubon persuaded George Keats to take over the note and own the steamboat, which is called the Henderson. And that turned out to have been built by the same man who built the grist mill, and it was underpowered to sail upriver. So a chain of lawsuits ensued. Audubon declared bankruptcy, was sent to jail for a period. And George, at the age of 21, was flat broke on the frontier. Audubon did something for Keats, however, intangible: the determination to succeed. One day when Keats had been flailing away for an hour of chopping some wood, Audubon said to him, "I'm sure you will do well in this country, Keats. The man who will persist, as you have been doing, in chopping that log, though it is taking you an hour to do what I could have done in 10 minutes, will certainly get along in this country." He then showed George how to use an axe gracefully. Well, it wasn't working in Henderson, so the Keats moved up to Louisville, and they apparently for a period lived in the Indian Queen Hotel owned by Mr. Gwathmey, which I suspect is familiar to many of you. And George went to work in Bakewell's sawmill at Brook and Washington Streets. Their first child, Georgiana, was born in Louisville, exciting a poem from John Keats, which read in part, "'Tis the witching time of night, orbed is the moon and bright. Listen, 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 and hear my lullaby." And it goes on from there. So it said 1819. It was a tough year for the Keatses in Kentucky, but it was a terrific year for John. I guess he was freed from his family responsibilities, and he completed the Eve of St. Agnes, his best odes, Lamia, Otho the Great, and Hyperion. And more importantly, he wrote a series of lengthy journal letters to George in Kentucky, detailing what his poetry meant, what his thoughts were. In those letters, which George saved, and then his daughter, Emma Keats Speed, also saved, eventually ended up in the Houghton Library at Harvard. And they've been hugely important to all Keats scholars to trying to understand romantic literature and what John had in mind. So in that sense, George earned a place in history, earned a place in romantic literature for having saved the letters. So meanwhile, they had a younger brother, Tom, who died in London. And he had his share of the estate that I mentioned earlier, but it was all tied up in chancery. So George went back. He borrowed money from Bakewell. It may have been his own money, recycled through Audubon to Bakewell, and went over for 5 months to London to settle up that estate and get some more funds to invest in Louisville. And when he returned, he had 700 pounds, worth something in the order of $700,000 today. And he had settled up John's debts to that point. But when he left London, he had that much money, and having paid off John Keats's debts, he left the poet with something like 70 pounds, 10%. And that left a bad taste with John and his friends, especially the friends who took on John as he started to die of consumption and became extremely dependent. So the day after George left the second time for America, John Keats hemorrhaged blood from his lungs and began a descent to his death in Rome a year later, 1821. In a short digression, that's 200 years ago, and there was to have been a commemoration of that, a dinner in Rome in about 3 or 4 weeks, which I'm a sponsor of, but I think I'm probably not going to go. It's just the COVID thing is too confusing. So John is buried in, for those of you Cave Hill aficionados, John is buried in the Protestant cemetery called the E Cattolica Cimitero, which is a gorgeous cemetery in the Trastevere, in the Testaccio district of Rome. And if you ever get over there, it's worth a half a day to go wander around and look at it. So George came back to Louisville. He was able to buy a 1/3 interest in this Prentice and Bakewell mill, and he received letters from Charles Brown, who I mentioned earlier, demanding money for George, which he didn't really have because he was just investing in the mill in Louisville. And so recriminations went back and forth across the Atlantic, but there was never any happy solution to that. One of the problems that I've had with doing George's biography is that the academics and there are about a dozen or more who've written books on John Keats, all tend to refer to George as that business brother. You know, like it's a terrible thing that he was a business brother. And one writer just sort of feeds another, and they don't really give George due credit because he did handle all the money honestly. But one of the outcomes of this was a failure to put together a so-called life and letters of John Keats. George owned, because he was John's heir, he owned about half of the material. And he, of course, knew the whole family story. And then this Charles Brown owned the other half, but they hated each other, couldn't agree on a publication plan. Starting in 1821, they went back and forth. The issue was finally resolved in 1848, 27 years later, when both George and Charles Brown had died. And a man named Richard Monckton Mills put together the volume. Mills had never met the poet, but that was the beginning of the whole cottage industry of Keats books. So the story kind of vanished for quite a period of time until, as I say, the Mills did a book, and then Amy Lowell came along in the 1920s. And then from that point forward, there have been, as I said, about a dozen books on John Keats. When John Kleber wrote the foreword to my book, he said, well, this really wouldn't be a book. It wouldn't be interesting about George, unless it's only because he's the brother of the poet that it's interesting. And there's some merit to that. But there is a history of Louisville which is interesting. By the way, there is a rather deep irony here, which was that there was a second trust fund, which none of the kids knew about. But in the flurry of lawsuits that happened after the death of the poet, this man, Charles Dilke, uncovered in Chancery the second trust fund, which was significant, worth about $500,000 in US currency today. So the kids did have money. George was able to get quiet. So let's go to Louisville. Here's an image of the falls of the Ohio. Pretty much what they would have seen when they came up from Henderson. Pretty much the view from their house at Brook and Washington, which is on the site of the mill. There's another picture here, the view from Clarksville, which I think most of you are probably familiar with. I saw that Jim Holmberg came on the call here. I just wanted to say that is a little digression, that once you get inside Jim Holmberg's head, you don't need to go to the index or to the computer. He knows everything that's in the Filson, particularly images. And he was very helpful in my assembling some of these images. This is doesn't show well, but it's a picture of Beargrass Creek entering the Ohio at what today is 3rd Street. And George's mill would have been down in the lower right corner. Beargrass Creek, as you know, is re-sited in about 1850 to where it is today, in order to have more commercial space on the waterfront. But the mill that George operated was conveniently there. Logs could float down from as far away as the Kentucky River, and then they became the building blocks of Main Street and Jefferson Street. Here's a map of Louisville. It doesn't show well on the screen, I apologize, but up in the upper right corner is a picture of where George and Bakewell's mill ended up. Down in the middle top is where the original mill was, at the intersection of Beargrass Creek and the Ohio River. Down toward the bottom left corner, it says Englishman's Palace, which I'll come to in a minute. That's where he lived ultimately. And then at the top left corner, it says Louisville Hotel. That was a major investment that he made, which we'll also come to in a few minutes. George always had an interest in steamboats, always concluding disastrously. I'll just throw this slide in. It had nothing to do with him, but it was a typical slide you would see in the journal at the time. And these boats were always being, built and sold and resold, and it's quite a cottage industry. So George wrote to his sister, Fanny Keats, who was married to a liberal in Spain, that he was having a hard time getting accepted in Louisville. He wrote to her and said, quote, "Our circumstances will not allow us to associate with what is called the first, or in other words, the richest people here." However, as he became more prosperous, things began to change. That same year of the letter, 1824, he became a warden of the fire company. In the next year, maybe because of his name and his relationship to the poet, he was invited into the Philosophical Society. And although its membership list is elusive, out of it came the Unitarian Church, the Lyceum, the Kentucky Historical Society, and ultimately the University of Louisville, all of whose boards George eventually served on. But the members of the Philosophical Society would meet in homes of the members, and they would discuss things like phrenology or the economics of Thomas Carlyle. So pretty heady stuff. Ralph Waldo Emerson was aware of them. He sent them books to read. In 1826, Keats's partner, David Prentice, died, and George and a man named Joseph Middleton were charged with being executors of the estate. And as you can see here, is an ad. Again, if you've done research in the Filson, you've seen a number of these ads. They all have that in the upper left corner of the picture of the runaway slave, which segues us into George's attitude towards slavery. Obviously, his group of friends and relations in London were opposed to slavery. He was as well. That's why he wanted to go to Illinois, a free state. But he ended up in Louisville, and he needed labor. And as a practical reality, you couldn't really hire much labor, white labor in Louisville, because most of the whites wanted to make their own fortune. They didn't want to work for somebody else. And those who were willing, the whites who were willing to work alongside slaves, worked at very, very low wages, giving rise to the term of slave wages. The better educated immigrants who came from Germany or Eastern Europe, for the most part, held up in Pittsburgh or Cincinnati or Chicago, which were free states. And those cities, of course, got a jump on Louisville in terms of manufacturing, because Louisville didn't have the skill sets coming in. So while this is going on, George advertised. He really had no choice. He advertised to buy 10 slaves. But instead, Dr. Urban Epionitis Ewing, a name that's probably familiar to many of you who invested heavily in enslaved, leased George the required number for about $70 a year, plus food, clothing, and small cash payments directly to the slaves. Dr. Ewing kept them in good health, and the slaves were free to stay in the city overnight if they wished. And if they weren't busy, they could even hire themselves out for the day and keep the money. So Louisville's, I would say, moderate approach to slavery can be summed up in an oft-repeated conversation between the Boston liberal Samuel Osgood and Judge John Speed, which went like this, quote, "Judge, I do not sleep, but the slaves are as happy as our laboring classes in the North." "Well," answered the judge, "I do the best I can to make my slaves comfortable, but you cannot make a slave happy. Do what you will. God Almighty never made man to be a slave." Keats, like the city itself, made his own moral compromise and got on with the work. So in 1827, moving forward, the town's trustees sent a bill up to the legislature petitioning to become a city, which was granted, and in part to charter the first bridge across the Ohio. George was named a bridge commissioner along with James Guthrie, who became his personal attorney and later, as you know, Secretary of the Treasury. Also on the board were John Tyler and John Jeremiah Jacob, who was Louisville's richest citizen. Obviously, George's circumstances had changed. It took a long time. And this is an 1867 image, but that's the bridge that they were talking about. And it finally got done as a result of the Civil War. So on the family front, the Keatses had 8 children. In 1828, Georgiana took 2 of them back to London to see her aging mother, and finally to settle some residual matters in Chancery. You may recall Dickens wrote a novel called Bleak House, and that was about Chancery, where wills were probated and sometimes never probated. They just go there and get lost. It's always a huge hassle to get anything out of Chancery, but she went over and tied up the final aspects of the Keats family inheritance. By the way, this picture is out of order, but this is a later picture of the Locks, which also got their start around 1837. It's a colorized postcard in the Filson. So when Georgiana returned from London, her trip, George went up to New York to meet her, and these silhouettes were taken. You'll recall from that first image that he looked rather balding, although he was only 20 years old. So I suspect that he actually was bald by this time. Came back to Louisville, and this is a nice little picture of their 3 daughters, a silhouette, which is taken. 2 of them are Emma and Ella, and they both married into the Speed family, whereas Georgiana married a Gwathmey. So between them, they're connected to Speeds and Bullets, and probably of the 600 ancestors of the Keats who are alive today, including Keats Thaxton, who's on this call, 90% of them are also Speeds. One more thing about George and his religion was that he was a charter subscriber to Christ Church on 2nd Street. But by 1830, he had converted to Unitarianism. What happened was that one Sunday, there was an interfaith picnic in town, and George came across some children and asked why they were not at the picnic. "Oh," one of them replied, "we're Unitarians. We weren't invited." That aroused his curiosity, and so he later made the conversion. By the 1830s, flush with cash, George went on a building spree. He was the principal developer and owner of the Louisville Hotel, pictured here on Main Street at 7th. And that was probably, I can't guarantee, but probably the view from the hotel at the time. He built his home, which the local people called the Englishman's Palace, which is on Walnut, now Muhammad Ali, between 3rd and 4th. The last time I was in Louisville, I think it was still the site of an abandoned Stewart's annex, but maybe it's got a different role today. So that was home, where he did own 2 household slaves whom the family released after he died, and they paid the slaves way to Canada. So that's, you can make your own judgment on that. Governor of Kentucky, oh, and here's some just a local picture. I don't know that Keats had much connection with it, but it's a nice image of the Oakland Raceway down by Central Park in Louisville. Governor put him on the board of the Lexington and Ohio Railroad, which I think actually did go from Lexington to Louisville in fits and starts. And it was a precursor to the L&N, the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. In the beginning, oh, I don't have it, I'm sorry. In the beginning, the railroad ran right down Main Street, but the local residents couldn't stand the smoke and the clatter, so the engine was disengaged out in the suburbs, and it was drawn by horses from there out to shipping ports. They're quieter than the steam engine. Here's an early picture of the University of Louisville, and which I think was just called college in those days. George's interest was in the medical aspect, and he helped to acquire a number of the surgical instruments from England and attract various medical students to come. I have a little sidebar here that George is also a founder and treasurer of the Kentucky Historical Society, whose head was Judge John Rowan of my old Kentucky home. And this is a good Kentucky story. Here, the historians in the audience, I probably will remember that Judge Rowan killed a Dr. Chambers in a duel, which followed an argument as to which of them was the better scholar of dead languages. Certainly worth having a duel over. Dr. Chambers, the Greek scholar, didn't survive. Rowan, in an example of Kentucky justice, was acquitted for lack of evidence, and he went on to the U.S. Senate. Another of the Historical Society trustees was the newspaperman George Prentice, who we'll visit in a minute. George is also a director of the Bank of Kentucky, which was hurriedly cobbled together to replace the U.S. Bank, which Andrew Jackson had scuttled. The loss of the old bank had wrecked business lending, even did away with the universal currency. The merchants in Louisville had to deal in specie, paper, different kinds of paper printed by the local banks. All this confusion brought on the Panic of 1837, which was not dissimilar to the Great Recession that we saw here a dozen years ago. The Bank of Kentucky had planned to send George over to London to raise capital, as he was a director of the bank, but the economy was so bad that the trip was canceled. He never got back. He was also involved in a thing called the Harlan Museum, which stood on the site of the today's Louisville Science Center. And in those days, they referred to it as a curiosity cabinet. One of the visitors wrote, quote, "I paid 25 cents and went into the museum where I saw near 3,000 natural curiosities consisting of animals, vegetables, and minerals, together with a splendid gallery of painting, both ancient and modern." Whatever happened to that Harlan Museum, I have no idea. I dug and researched, but couldn't really find out. Maybe Jim Holberg knows. Okay, one other slide here, which is the Bank of Louisville, I'm sorry, designed by Gideon Schryock. And to my knowledge, if research is correct, it's the only building which is still extant today from that time frame. So by 1841, as this story proceeds, George is now a full-blown Kentuckian, a slave owner and user. He's a Whig, hated Andrew Jackson, won a seat on the board of Alderman, and curiously bailed out his friend Tom Bakewell in this year. Bakewell had decided to build the largest steamboat ever to appear on the Ohio River, and he had contracted with the Portland Dry Dock to build the hull. And then Bakewell defaulted on the loan and left town. And George, as the guarantor of the note, paid it off. He scrambled to monetize all of his own assets to honor the commitment. And then you would have thought that at age 44 he had time to recover his finances, but he developed some gastrointestinal ailment. And on Christmas Eve, 1841, he died. He was virtually illiquid. So George Prentice, whom I mentioned earlier, wrote an obituary in the paper that said, Mr. Keats possessed much of the genius and all of the philosophy, benevolence, and enlarged philanthropy of the lamented bard. When such a one passes away, every heart among us feels a mysterious chill, as if touched by the awful shadow of a tomb. Imagine that in an obituary today. The executor of George's estate was none other than James Speed, who became, as you know, Attorney General to Lincoln's second Attorney General. In the aftermath, the bank got the house. The other creditors got about 20 cents on the dollar, what was owed. Within 15 months, Georgiana married John Jeffrey, a Scottish engineer, 20 years her junior. She moved to Cincinnati, then they moved to Lexington. The daughter, Isabel Keats, just before moving out of the Englishman's palace, shot herself in the heart. And she's buried out at Cave Hill. Everybody seems to end up at Cave Hill. There's a footnote to this. When James Speed was preparing the inventory of assets, there was a copy of Audubon's book called Ornithology, valued at $3. One of those books recently sold at auction for $1.25 million in New York, but who knows what happened to his copy? I have no idea. Keats had a friend named James Freeman Clarke, who was a noted Unitarian, and he did a very, very gracious sketch of George in the Dial, which is the organ of that church, as did Samuel Osgood. We're almost at the end, but we have to remember Georgiana, his wife, his widow. Here she is, 1875, living in a hotel in Lexington, blind, we think, and clearly having a bad hair day. But Georgiana lived through a lot. She lived through the Regency in London, George IV. She lived through the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. She witnessed Louisville's emergence from the frontier to the entrepot. She lived through the American Civil War, the arrival of railroads, the beginning of the Gilded Age. Died in 1879. She had 8 children, at least 1 miscarriage. Saw 4 of her children predecease her. And like so many in Louisville, here's where she ended up. Cave Hill Cemetery. So that's pretty much my story. I have some questions which we can get into, and somebody's going to take charge of the computer here and help me out. But we can think about who was
I'm here.
Hi, Dick. I'll just throw these out quickly, then Dick can moderate. Who was Georgiana's father? And I think I know. She had a scrapbook, which also ended up at the Houghton Library at Harvard. And there are 2 military commissions, both signed by George III, one for Adjutant Wiley, who I mentioned before, who died 3 years prior to her birth, and the other for somebody named Augustus Gaskell. And since Georgiana's middle name is Augusta, and why would she have this commission in her scrapbook? So I think he must have been the father, but never bothered to get married. Then there's always been this debate: should George have attended to his needs in Louisville, or should he have done more for John? Should he have taken money that he needed for his own family and sent it to Rome to support John's medical bills? Was he a bad brother? I don't know. Was Audubon honest with George? Big debate. I did not mention earlier, there's a man named Felix Smith who ended up being George's partner. And Felix Smith was probably the brains of the operation. George was more the personality. I spoke about slavery. Some of you may have a strong disagreement with what I said, which I welcome. Why did people guarantee somebody else's debt? I would never do that, but it happened. And then was George a Mason after being a Unitarian? What was it? What was about that pyramid that we saw in Cave Hill? Kind of a Masonic thing with a cross on top of it. The weird. I once asked Lee Squires if I could take the cross down. He had a conniption fit and said, "No way." He said, and that was there for a reason. So I'm through. Dick, take over.
All right. Wonderful presentation, Larry. Thank you so much. A question: do you know whether George subscribed to Audubon's Birds of America? This questioner asks that, or says that she's read that subscriptions were slow among Americans.
I believe he did, and the divided opinion about Audubon versus George is that Georgiana, who was a bit testy, the widow, she didn't like Audubon, and she kept perpetuating the myth that Audubon had cheated George. But I think he himself was okay. He didn't. I believe he was a subscriber. That's why he had the book. He had a couple other things by Audubon as well, which were less important.
Was Keats a good businessman? When he died, how much money was there? Which I guess is a way, from the way you've described him, that he might have measured himself.
I think it's an excellent question, and my own answer is no. He was not all that good. He was really a hard worker. He would go out into the countryside. He'd go as far as southern Illinois, up the Kentucky River, scouting out lumber to buy for the mill. And he worked nonstop, and he was involved in developing a lot of real estate. But I think that this man I just mentioned at the very end, Felix Smith, was the brains of the operation. George is more of a joiner, more of a good guy, a sales guy, but probably not a brilliant investor.
The Englishman's house, did he design and build it?
I think so. That picture, by the way, is pretty dramatic.
Yes, it is.
After it ended up as a school, and it was torn down around 1920, and I came across a black and white image of it, and I didn't fiddle with it. I only had it colorized. That's what it looked like. And there are plenty of houses in London that look fairly similar. So I think he just was modeling on what he would like to have owned in London.
How long was George in Henderson? And aside here, it has to be in the top 5 of beautiful Kentucky towns. It's absolutely gorgeous.
Henderson, he was there over the winter, and the Audubon had quite a spread. He had dug out a pond, and he was raising turtles for turtle soup, and he had ducks whose wings he had clipped, and he was a real farmer. And it's now all been covered over. It's in kind of in the center of Henderson, but it was not an unpleasant place to start out Kentucky life.
it looks, if you could just sum up George Keats in one word, would it be entrepreneur?
That's good.
And what made him that way?
Need. I think he came from a pretty dismal background in England, and he wanted economic opportunity, and he just couldn't find it in his own mind in London. And it was a difficult period, the Regency period. People were being thrown in jail. You could criticize George IV because he was fat. You'd end up in jail for a year. And most of his friends were like Leigh Hunt and others were sort of anti-Regency. So he didn't have a lot of introduction to proper society.
Yeah. Can you talk further about George's views on slavery, and can you supplement that with how, is there anything by John Keats on the subject of slavery?
To my knowledge, no. I don't think John got into it. Clearly, his friends, Keats's friends, were all on the liberal side of things. And I'm going to digress here for a second. Shelley, who was part of that operation, what was his wife? Oh, Mary Wollstonecraft. She was a leading advocate for abolition of slavery throughout the English Empire. So John Keats, I don't think there's any written evidence of this, but I'm sure he was quite opposed to slavery, and he would not have been happy to know that his brother owned and hired slaves, but that's all hypothesis.
When you were talking about the Harlan Museum, was it Harlan?
That's correct. And if you were to go to the Louisville Science Center, as I did a couple of years back, there is one little corner where they have a testimony to what it was, which is pretty rudimentary. And there was a guy named Harlan, I forget his first name, who actually lived in Philadelphia and gave some of the stuff. They have to call it stuff. I don't think it's particularly valuable, but there are, dinosaur bones and that sort of thing. Harlan gave it to this operation in Louisville. That's what they named it for him.
The only reason I asked is that the great Justice John Harlan, practiced for a while.
I don't think so.
All right.
No.
And then, gosh, we're running out of time, sadly, at 7:00. Was Keats irresponsible regarding his brother John? Let's end it with that question.
I don't think so. What happened was that when George went back to London, John had been sick. He had doctor's bills, and he hadn't paid the butcher, the wine purveyor, and he was really pretty seriously in debt. And so George figured out they each were entitled to about 700 pounds, and as I said, worth 700,000. And he meticulously paid off all of John's debts, but in the process, out of John's own money. But in the process, he wiped out John, and then he went off to America with his, which he hadn't had any need to use. So could he have given, as an act of charity, some of his money to support his brother? Should he have done that? And that's the debate. I don't know. There was an audit done, and he was vindicated. Even Fanny Braun, who did not like George, felt that he had been abused and maligned, and he was honest. But that didn't stop Charles Brown from badmouthing him for another 20 years.
Oh, and none of us are so different. I suppose we have to ask ourselves, if we had a sibling in trouble, what would we do? I cannot thank you enough for this presentation. It was so much fun. Your ability to plow into Kentucky history through your family's history and British history is remarkable and so much fun to be part of tonight. Thank you.
Well, once again, it would not have happened except for the Filson. So I thank you.
I'll simply say on behalf of the Filson, we are immodestly proud of what we're doing in the city, the state, the region, the country with the resources that we have. And thanks, everybody.
Okay.
Good night to all of you.